morning. Today I'm joined by Dr. Peter Tickner, and we're going to talk about Cressey's fraud triangle, or not so much Cressey's fraud triangle, as we will find out in this podcast. Obviously, to everyone, I'm Professor Mark Button. I'm Director of the Centre for Counter Fraud Studies, and I'll just let Peter introduce a bit about himself before we get into the meat of the discussion. Peter.
Thank you, Mark. Yes, well, I'm Peter Tickner. I spent a 40-year career as an auditor and fraud investigator, and late in life decided to become an academic. And thanks to Mark's kind tuition, I managed to achieve that earlier this year. So that's where we find ourselves. But I've always had an interest in the history of fraud investigation and books about fraudsters and thieves and so on. So it's an area that I've tended to research out of interest as much as anything else.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Now, before we start to uncover some of the things that you have found out about Cressey's fraud triangle, I wonder if you could just briefly explain how most people see Cressey's fraud triangle. What does it seek to explain?
Right. Well, in the simplest level, it seeks to explain why people commit fraud. It's about the motivation of people to commit fraud. And to that end, the triangle has three elements, as you would expect. There's a perceived pressure to commit the fraud. There's a perceived opportunity to be able to achieve the fraud, and a way to rationalize the behavior of the individual to explain away why they can do that and carry on functioning. So that, in its simplest terms, would be how you would describe Cressey's fraud triangle.
Okay, thank you. Now, anyone who's ever read his book, Other People's Money, will struggle to find any mention. That book. Will struggle to find the mention of the word fraud triangle, and indeed in some of the other works that he has published. Now, people often speak at conferences and they put up pictures of the fraud triangle. Could you perhaps shed some light on how we got from Cressey's book, Other People's Money, to the Cressey fraud triangle?
This is actually quite to me, I find it a fascinating story. And it actually starts with a guy called Sven de Reimer, who was he was a German occupational psychologist, and he was married to a Jewish girl. So as you can imagine, when Hitler came to power in the 1930s, Reimer had to leave Germany fairly pronto. He went to Sweden, and while he was in Sweden, he decided to research embezzlers, fraudsters. And he researched 100 cases at a prison in Sweden. But before he'd finished his research, the Second World War broke out, and he ended up publishing his research in America, where he knew of Sutherland and the work of Edwin Sutherland, who, of course, invented the term white-collar crime. And Sutherland just published an article before him in 1940, in which he thought that the reason why people committed white-collar crime was connected with his differential association theory. So he was very much saying that it's who you mix with, who you know, your sort of background that makes you want to commit fraud, particularly white-collar fraud. Reimer's study of embezzlement, he produced as a paper in 1941, just a few months after Sutherland had been banging on about this. And in it, he identified three factors. He said that there was a social pull, which was the opportunity to commit the fraud. There was a social push, which was the perceived pressure to commit the fraud. And then there was the pathological factor, the psychological makeup of the individual that made them commit the fraud. So Reimer identified three factors as way back in 1941. Cressey, Don Cressey, who started life in quite a strange way, but ended up an academic. He was really from quite a poor background. He fought in the Second World War as an ordinary soldier and became quite a hero in his own way. And then after the war, tried to become an academic, and Sutherland took him under his wing. So Cressey decided to research further into embezzlers and fraudsters. And in doing that, he was obviously looking at Sutherland's differential association theory as the way he thought he'd find the answer. But when he looked at, as Reimer had done, he picked on a number of prisoners in state prisons who'd been sent to prison for embezzlement. Slightly different definition in America, but largely the same thing as fraud. And in the process of looking at these people, he realized that Sutherland's theories didn't work. They didn't really fit the scenario. So he then looked at Reimer's work, and he notes that in his other People's Money's book, he looked at Reimer and he looked at what the points that Reimer had come up with. And he picked on the first two, the opportunity and the pressure, and he built them into his theories. And he ended up with a theory where he was saying that, if I could find the quote, I'll even quote it to you, but bear with me a second. He said that trusted persons become trust violators when they perceive themselves as having a financial problem which is non-shareable. So that's the pressure bit. Are aware that the problem can be secretly resolved by violation of the position of financial trust. So that's the opportunity. And are able to apply their own conduct to that situation, verbalizations, which enable them to adjust the way they think about themselves, that they can live with it, basically. And that, of course, is the rationalization part of it. He found this theory fitted all the cases that he looked at. And he then went back and looked at some of Sutherland's earlier cases and found it fitted Sutherland as well. So on that basis, Cressey produced the book Other People's Money, as you and I know, which was really a book based on his PhD thesis. And the PhD thesis came up with this 3 theoretical points, which are slightly different from Reimer's, but you can see the root is Reimer's that Cressey's built it on. But he didn't call it a fraud triangle. He didn't even call it an embezzlement triangle. He just presented it as a theory about why people commit fraud. And at that point, Cressey moved on to other research. And he didn't, although he kept going on white collar crime on the thing that Sutherland did on differential association, he didn't really do any other research of his own that looked specifically into this. And it all might have stayed as just a purely academic piece of work of interest to academic and psychologists and social researchers, but not necessarily of any interest to the fraud investigation world. But later in Cressey's life, a character called Joseph Wells, who founded the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, was at the time investigating a case before he'd founded the Fraud Examiners, and he wondered if there were any theories about why people committed fraud. And he found Cressey's book. Having read it, he being a typical sort of ex-FBI man, he just rang up Cressey and said, "Can I come and see you?" Unheard of in the worlds of academia. So he met Cressey, they became good friends, but this was towards the ends of Cressey's life. And Cressey just said to him, there ought to be a way of marrying the way accountants look at the world and auditors with the way academics look at the world about fraud, and you ought to be able to bring the two together. And that's what, after Cressey's death, Wells thought about that, and he decided to press for a certification of fraud examiners. While he was doing that, a friend of his who was an academic accountant was Steve Albrecht. And Steve Albrecht had already conducted some research in the late 1970s with some colleagues about what motivates people to commit fraud. And what he'd come up with was what he called the fraud balance. And the fraud balance, again, looked back a bit to Reimer, because he identified situational pressures. Well, that's straight out of Reimer or Cressey. Opportunities to commit the fraud. Well, that's straight out of Reimer or Cressey. But then he came up with personal integrity as his third element. And that was his fraud balance. And the idea being that if those factors were tipped too much on the bad side of the scale, you committed fraud. If they were tipped on the good side of the scale, you didn't commit fraud. And I actually quite like that model, to be honest, but we'll come back to that. But then Albrecht was invited by Joe Wells to become the first president of the ACFE, which he did. And he and Wells were giving lectures all the time to people, training people about fraud. And they were using Cressey's 3 factors, but they weren't calling it a fraud triangle. Cressey never called it that in his lifetime, and they weren't, even in the 80s. But then Albrecht was giving a lecture to a group of company workers about dealing with fraud, and one of them said, well, isn't that just like the FAR triangle? When you're talking about Cressey. And of course, the FAR triangle is this idea that a FAR can only start when you've got fuel, heat, and oxygen, the 3 points of a FAR. But you can put a FAR out by stopping any of the 3 of them. And of course, the idea of the Cressey's fraud point was that all of those have to exist for fraud to be committed. But if any one of them wasn't present, the person wouldn't commit fraud. And that's what Cressey had found in his imprisonment study. So at that point, Albrecht thought, we've got a fraud triangle here. So he then wrote a paper in 1991 in which he linked Cressey's work to what he called the fraud triangle. So that's really where it all starts from. So poor old Cressey knew nothing about it his entire lifetime.
That's absolutely fascinating, Peter. Now, obviously, the triangle has experienced a number of criticisms, and I know you're very critical of Cressey's fraud triangle. Could you talk us through some of the common criticisms of this approach?
Well, I mean, there are a number of problems with the fraud triangle. Cressey himself, when he was writing about his three factors, said that they only worked for the cases he'd looked at. These were white males accused of embezzlement and in prison in the States. And that if you took a broader view of the population of people who committed embezzlement crimes or fraud, you might come to a different conclusion. He himself recognized that and said there was more room for further research. And in fact, there has been further research since, and other models have come up. But my issue, I think, is as somebody who was a practitioner for so many years, I have to tell you, I never once used Cressey's fraud triangle to help me either solve a fraud or develop the result of a fraud. I think there is a difference if you're a police officer investigating a crime related to fraud, whether it be conspiracy to defraud or whether it be one of the fraud act ones that we have now, or even one of the US fraud criminal offences. Because for a police officer, you've often got to establish motive as part of getting a criminal conviction. So therefore, Cressey's fraud triangle can come into play. However, for most practical investigators or internal investigations of internal or contractor fraud, which is where I spent most of my effort, you don't know anything other than the opportunity the person has had to commit the fraud. You don't know about the two other aspects. You have no idea what pressure they're facing in their personal or their official life. You have no idea how predisposed they are towards criminalization, how good they are at rationalizing their behavior. You don't know. And you have no obvious means of measuring that either before you discover the fraud or before you look for the fraud. And so if I'm looking for a fraud, I'm not looking for people who might have an ability to rationalize. I'm not looking for people who are under pressure because I don't have the data to establish that information when I'm looking at an organization's employees. Now, if somebody makes an accusation about somebody, well, maybe I've got something to work on. But without a specific accusation and somebody in a senior position, you're very rarely going to be having the luxury of knowing these factors before you start an investigation, or indeed before you conclude an investigation.
Yeah.
So for my objections are mainly of a practical rather than a theoretical nature.
And what about your extensive experience of finding fraudsters? And how many would you estimate actually met all three requirements of the fraud triangle?
Well, that's the other thing. I think it depends how you define the factors. And of course, the factors have been defined differently over the years. I quite like the idea of personal integrity, which Albrecht had in his balance, and which doesn't really come into rationalization. The trouble about rationalizing is that some people don't feel the need to rationalize their behavior. There are people who are egotistical. There are people who are self-centered, who just see everything they do as perfectly okay. So they don't worry about whether it's wrong. There are other people who do worry about it and can rationalize it, but rationalize it in a different way to the way that Cressey envisaged. Equally, when you talk about pressure, I've known people commit fraud simply because they wanted to. It just the way they saw the world. There was no particular financial pressure on them. They were perfectly well off. They had everything they needed in life, but they still felt the urge to commit fraud. A colleague of mine who was an ex-detective superintendent, he and I were talking about this the other day, and he remembers a particular case where a guy came up with a brilliant internet idea that could make a lot of money, but he started ripping people off and got sent to prison. After he came out of prison, he found another variation on it and did exactly the same thing again and got nicked again by my colleague. And when he said to him, look, you had a brilliant idea here. You could have made a lot of money without stealing. He said, yes, but where would the fun have been in that? So sometimes people are motivated by reasons that fall outside of anything envisaged by the Cressey's fraud triangle.
Mm.
I think I think that's important to recognise.
Yes. Now, some academics have sought to take the fraud triangle on, and we've had the emergence of the fraud diamond.
Oh yeah.
Could you take us through that one, Peter?
Oh yes, this is Wolf and Hermanson, and this was an article that appeared in about 2004, I think it was originally, and they recognise that there are weaknesses in the fraud triangle in fitting every case to the fraud triangle. So their idea was to add in the element of capability. And you can interpret capability quite widely. And this is what I find difficult. The moment an academic says to me, well, we're interpreting this quite widely, I'm saying, hang on a minute, you're an academic. You're supposed to be quite specific. Where's the specificity in this argument? So capability can be interpreted as the person's self-ability to rationalize. It can be interpreted as the person having the guts to do it. It can be interpreted as a person having the intellectual wherewithal to be able to work out how to do it. So you can interpret capability in a quite wide sense. But yes, it does add a kind of neatness, a fraud diamond. It still doesn't help me with my practical investigation side of the business.
Now, Schuchter and Levi have also sought to develop it with this idea of the inner voices. What do you think about their approach?
Well, I think Schuchter and Levi's study is actually quite interesting, though very limited. I mean, they themselves know they only looked at 13 cases. And 13, as we know, is not even a statistically acceptable sample size of the entire population of fraudsters out there. It's one of the problems with fraud, of course, that we never know who's actually committing it. We only know who got caught. So you're never quite sure that any model you're producing fits anything other than the unsuccessful fraudster. But having said that, what they identified, well, they looked at very much the people that Sutherland thought of as white-collar criminals. They looked at top-end fraudsters, mainly Swiss, obviously, because Schuchter was Swiss-based, and therefore they were looking at Swiss prison criminals who were prepared to talk to them. But these people were all major players in their own organisations before they were found guilty of fraud or embezzlement. And the thing that came out of that was that for many of them, they certainly weren't motivated by financial pressure. A couple of them were, and there were a couple where Levi and Schuchter identified there was financial pressures that they themselves, the criminal, didn't recognise. So then you come back to Cressey's fraud triangle about perceived pressure. But if they didn't perceive pressure, did they have pressure? These are difficult things, and semantics perhaps, but they're important. So Schuchter and Levi's research shows that perceived pressure didn't apply in these top fraudsters, the kind of white-collar criminals that, in fact, Sutherland was originally talking about. But instead of rationalisation, they had an inner voice of conscience that they found a way round before they could commit the fraud. And then afterwards, it ate away at them when they were caught. But whether it was eaten away with them before they were caught or if they were never caught, one forms the view that probably not. It was the act of being caught that made them think about their inner voice. But brings me back to the basic problem with fraud investigation, that you don't know about the ones you don't catch. Every time I thought somebody was committing a fraud, I have to tell you, in 40 years, I found they were. But how many times did I not think they were committing a fraud and they were? I don't know. I have no objective means of measuring that particular variable.
Well, thank you very much for that, Peter. Sort of reflecting on a kind of lifetime of dealing with fraud, these whole family of theories, do they actually have any benefits to a practitioner? If you were starting out again, would you teach these to practitioners?
Well, despite what I've said, I probably would. But I would teach them with a pinch of salt. I would say these are just a way of understanding human behavior. But we all know that if you look at human behavior, you can take a continuum from totally honest to totally dishonest. And almost every human being falls between those extremes. So therefore, the vast majority of any human being employed in any organization has a capacity for committing fraud. It's just the degree of that capacity varies according to the individual. Then you've got to add on to that whether there would be pressure in the particular circumstance to make them think about fraud as one of the solutions. Then you've got to think about whether they're in an organisation position to commit that. And the thing that Reimer had identified right back at the beginning was that the kind of people who commit embezzlement, white-collar type crimes are people who've made their way through organisations and have reached some kind of crisis later on in life. This doesn't happen usually at the beginning unless you're a habitual career criminal. And there are fraudsters who are habitual criminals, and we know that. Most of them don't tend to work for organisations, they tend to attack organisations. So that's a different kind of fraud criminal. And you might get that more on the internet side, where, of course, you don't have to be part of an organisation to commit the fraud. There you do get the vast numbers of habitual criminals out there who spend their lives trying to defraud you, and we know that. But you're not worried about their motivation. You just know they're a crook. You've got to stop them. But when you come to the internal people and contractors and people you work with and people at senior positions in power, then these issues come into play, and you've got to think about what's the best way of both identifying the risk of fraud being committed by these individuals. So you want to try and prevent it. So there's some of the issues around opportunity and pressure come into play. You still won't know about rationalisation. I would still argue you don't know about that. You don't know about the propensity in their head to commit fraud. You're never going to know enough without even any psychometric test you run. And as we know with lie detectors, they're not infallible against the best criminals. They're very good against you or I on the normal decent human beings, because we react in a guilty way if something bad that we've done becomes exposed. But the hardened criminal doesn't react in a guilty way and therefore can't be measured by those standards. And equally, we don't know where somebody sits on that scale in order to measure whether they've got a propensity and whether we can put some measures in place to prevent them committing fraud. So you come back to organisational controls, you come back to audits, you come back to the normal ways of trying to reduce the risk, or just having organisations with good ethics, people at the top end who really care about their organisation and what they're doing. But as Sutherland himself identified way back in the 1930s, you can have two corporations, one with a really good man who gives to charity, who looks after his workers and who's quite altruistic, the other run by a complete shit. But you can find that both the organisations are still committing the same frauds. So I don't think at the end of the day the theories have yet brought us to a final stop. We haven't mentioned mice either. We should mention mice, I suppose, in this. And mice was a way of looking at the bit about rationalisation and motivation and saying, why do people commit fraud? And mice is money, ideology, coercion, and ego. That's what we're talking about there. And that's down to somebody called Jason, I've forgotten his surname, Jason Thomas. But that's another quite late on theory that came out in about 2010. But the trouble with mice is, again, that actually works quite well for the kind of Swiss top-end fraudsters that Shooter and Levi are talking about. I'm not sure it's so convincing for your average middle manager fraudster or contractor fraudster. So that's probably where I stand on it.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Peter. That's been a very illuminating discussion. We're going to have a few more of these discussions about different theories related to white-collar crime, fraud and corruption. And there'll be some further reading at the end of this this video, which you can look to, and including some of Peter's extensive works on countering fraud. Thank you very much.